Hello, Blake Rudis here with Everyday HDR and HDR Insider, and today I want to take another closer look at Topaz ReMask. And the reason why is because in the last Topaz ReMask 4 tutorial I pretty much used the same image and made the photograph look better, making a series of selections on the same photograph. I didn't replace any skies, I didn't do anything in particular, so I wasn't really showing off maybe the true potential of ReMask. I was more showing off the true potential of the idea of separating one image with a series of masks. So here I want to show you two different options, and this is because I've received several requests for this tutorial with how to, number one, replace a sky, and number two, how to put another background on a subject, so kind of like a composite. So it's basically what I'm going to be showing you today. So with this photograph, I'm going to stop into Topaz ReMask. So I'm going to go to Filter, Topaz Labs, and ReMask 4. So in ReMask 4, if you're using a different version of ReMask, you're going to see that everything's a little bit different over here on the left. So if you have the ability to just go to the Topaz Labs website and upgrade your version, they do free upgrades from version to version, so you don't have to worry about that. But basically, I'm going to do the same workflow I did last time. I'm just going to draw a blue line around all of the questionable areas. So these are the areas that you think, okay, I don't want to have to do any work to separate, so I'm going to just highlight them in blue, and I'm going to tell ReMask to do all the hard work. And that's what we're going to do here. Very similar, same thing. And I'm using a Wacom tablet, so I get kind of messy sometimes. When I say Wacom tablet, it's kind of laughable because I'm using a Wacom tablet from like 2005 or something like that. It's like a Wacom Bamboo Fun tablet. I don't do a whole lot of digital painting, so I don't see the need in something crazy. Alright, so then after I've painted blue around the area that I want to separate, I'm going to press the fill for red, the red fill, and then just press compute mask. Now that red fill is going on the opposite side of all, that's basically all the stuff that I want to disappear. Now because I put that blue buffer around everything I wanted to stay, when I put that red fill back there and I press compute mask, it's going to do its best effort to make everything disappear back there. Now I can see that right here up at the top of the church, there's some stuff that's trying to disappear from the church. So if I go back into the brush and just make it a little bit smaller and click the green brush in those areas, I don't even have to paint. All I have to do is click, and it's responsive enough to know that it wants me to select more than just what I'm telling it to select. So it's pretty smart in that capability. And I think, let's look at the mask and let's see how it looks. So here's our cut, our keep. Here's our cut. So I like to look at the keep and the cut. The keep and the cut. The keep is going to tell me exactly what it is that we're going to keep, and the cut is telling me what we're cutting away. So I always check those edges to make sure this is a really easy selection. So almost any selection method could have made this one. The next one's going to be a little bit more intricate. So I'm going to press OK. But I really showed you this image because I want to show you some tips and tricks on how to get your images to look the same. Now, you can't just replace a photograph with any color sky. It doesn't work that way. You have to try and replace it with a sky that looks similar, and if it doesn't look similar, you have to know how you can make it look similar. So the sky that I've chosen is this sky right here. Now, if you can see, there is a sun flare here. Now, both of these images were taken at about probably between 12 and 2 o'clock in the afternoon. So that's why they work well together, because they were taken at about the same time. A couple other things here to look at. There are a lot of white hazy areas in this one. There's a lot of white hazy areas in the background of this one. They kind of match. So I'm going to drag this over and see what it looks like when I put it on the other one and put it right behind that layer. So I just dragged it and dropped it right on over, and I'm just going to replace that sky with the other one. And at this point I can make my composition with the sky and tell it exactly where I want it to go. But that's not it. There's more that needs to be done here. I'm actually going to press Control T and then Control 0 and make this a little bit smaller, make the sky itself a little bit smaller so that more of it fits into that background. Looks a little bit more realistic that way. Maybe just a little bit of blow out on those clouds. Maybe put that sun flare right above the chapel. Okay, so now that I've done all that work to do my composition, I'm actually going to go ahead and mess that up. So I'm going to move this down a little bit, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and match this blue to this blue. And how I'm going to do that is I'm going to go into a curves adjustment layer. And I make that curves adjustment layer only affect the sky by pressing Alt or Option in between the two. That's going to create what's called a clipping mask. And that clipping mask is only going to affect what's directly below it. So this curves adjustment is resting inside. So let's look at this layer 1, and let's just call this layer 1 a Tupperware container. Now this curves layer, because we clipped it, is only fitting into that Tupperware container. Okay, so now with this curves adjustment layer, we can go ahead and make the modifications that we want to the curves adjustment layer by looking at the darks of that curves adjustment layer, the midtones of that curves adjustment layer, and the highlights of that curves adjustment layer. So really what I want to affect are going to be more or less the midtones. So I'm going to bring those midtones up a little bit to try and make them match that sky in the background. Next thing I'm going to do is go into the blue layer, because I'm working on the blue channel here. And I'm going to try and match that blue with the background. And it's probably going to take a little bit of work here, but if I just drop the midtones a little bit and then maybe bring up in the highlights, I'm trying to get a decent color match. It doesn't have to be perfect, but I think here we're on to it right about there. And then if I go into the red channel and go into the cyans, I can look at adding a little bit of cyan by dropping the red down to introduce more cyan. It looks like we might need a little bit of red actually in those shadows. So that's pretty decent. Now here's the before and after. We're just barely trying to match this up. It doesn't have to be anything perfect. We can actually change that curves adjustment too. If we change that to something like maybe color or saturation, it's only going to affect the color and saturation of the colors in the image directly below it. So you see how our backgrounds are starting to match now. Another thing we can do here is press Command or Control J on our background, bring it up and above that curves layer. Go to Filter, go to Blur, go to Average, and then drop that to something like Soft Light or Overlay. And basically what we've done there, Hard Light actually looks pretty good too. Matches that background pretty well. And what we've done there is taken a sampling of our background layer, we blurred it to get the average of all the colors in that photo, and then helped match the color temperature of our background sky with the original photograph. So that's more than just what happens in Topaz ReMask. That's kind of what happens after the Topaz ReMask. But if you want to get that sky to match, here it doesn't match because our color temperatures are off. The color temperature is critical to getting those to match up. So that's the idea there. Drop that sky just a little bit there. So I'll go ahead and close this one down. Alright, so this next photo, what we're going to do is we're going to replace the background. Now, this background wasn't too bad, but it's actually just the backdrop of where my son was standing, and it wasn't a set up backdrop, it just happened to blur that way and look somewhat decent, but there's some distractions there. And I want to just show you some different options as to how you can take someone who was shot in a studio on maybe a white seamless or a green screen, and how you can drop in another background there and actually have them match pretty well as well. Very similar to what we did in the last one. So I'm going to go to Filter, Topaz Labs, and ReMask 4. Now you can see he takes after his father with his hair there. He likes to put jelly in his hair, that's what he calls it. It's a little bit more difficult to make a mask of someone who has jelly in their hair. So let's just go ahead and start it off the same way. We're going to put our blue line right around our subject. Okay. And this is going to be a blue line that's going to go in every area that's kind of hard for us to mask. So I'm going to do it all around all those areas of the hair. Now, there are other options for masking. You have something like the Refine Edge tool in Photoshop, which actually isn't that bad, but I tried to do the same selection with the Refine Edge tool as quickly as I do it in ReMask, and in my time trial I could not get it to beat Topaz ReMask. So in my opinion, I like Topaz ReMask because of its quickness, its speed, its ability to get me from one image to the next in my compositing workflow. That's really important in a compositing workflow, especially when you work with sometimes 90 plus layers. There's sometimes that my layers get that thick that I need something that works that quickly. So I messed up here, so I'm just going to switch to my green and go from there. Now I'm going to click that red fill and red fill in all the areas I don't want there to be and press compute mask. Now, if we look at the hair, we can see that it did a pretty good job. So let's look at keep, let's look at cut. Now it is cutting away quite a bit of his hair though at the same time. So here's where we need to get a little bit more on the tricky side, and that's with the color range or the transparency. Now transparency would be like if you had a veil in a wedding gown and you wanted to make it look transparent like it is if they're on a beach or something. You would use that transparency brush. For this, we're going to use the color range brush. Before I get into that though, I'm going to clean up my mask. So I don't want to get too sloppy here. I'm going to clean it up by just pressing the green on the areas that I want to come back in here that I didn't quite get all the way. There's nothing wrong with that. And then the red in the areas that I didn't want to get. Again, you just kind of click and it's responsive enough to know that it wants me to keep those areas. So it'll slightly grow as I'm clicking those areas for my mask. Now, with this color range, I'm actually just going to go ahead and I'm going to zoom in pretty close on his hair so you can see this. I'm going to click on like this area right here. And then actually I'm going to change it to the red brush, because anything I click on with the color range is you have to ask yourself, do I want to keep this or cut this? So I'm going to click right here, and then I'm just going to paint out with the red on those areas that are kind of hazy, that don't seem like they're going to match. So if you look at what we're keeping and what we're cutting here, you can start to see that if I want to keep this portion of his hair, let me zoom in a little bit more, scoot this over. If I want to keep that portion, I'm just going to go ahead and press there and then brush that on. So I'm keeping those colors that are starting to disappear here in this haze that we have, this gray haze, where the bokeh of his hair is starting to compete with the background. So if I click on that little piece of brown that I want to keep there, again I'm clicking on those pieces of brown that I want to keep, go to the keep, go to the cut, and then I'll go back to that keep and then click on parts that I want to cut. I want to cut that gray out of there. There's another piece of gray I want to cut out. If it's still giving you a little bit of trouble, sometimes you can go to the blue and then just kind of click there in the blue to recover those areas that are giving you a tricky time. Now, it's a lot easier if you have very finite hairs. It's like these finite hairs right here would be a lot easier to work with than the hair that is kind of disappearing into the background there. So if I go to that color range, I click on this gray that I want to get rid of, I can just paint right there and it'll start helping me get rid of that gray. Again, if I'm having trouble, I'll just go to that blue brush and just kind of click on those troublesome areas and see if it can help me recover it. So let's go to what we're cutting, let's go to what we're keeping. We're going to have to tell ourselves, okay, at some point we can't grab everything. It's just not going to work out that way. But we're trying to get the best of both worlds here. So if I zoom in a little bit closer, and I go to that color range, and I want to keep this version of brown in his hair, it's working out pretty well there. So you see that? Even in those really finite details, it's working out pretty well. Alright, so I'm zooming out, and then I'll go to, that looks pretty good. Maybe right here, do the same thing there. Now I can also go to the recovery slider and see if that's going to help me in some of those areas, which it usually does. Retrieves a lot of the foreground and the weaker transparent areas is what it's telling you there. So if I go to the keep and the cut now, it seems to be doing a lot better. Let's look at the mask, and overall, when we zoom out back to normal, our mask looks pretty good, especially for something that was pretty difficult to deal with. Now I'm going to zoom in a little bit closer right here because I'm seeing some area here that I don't want. So I'm going to go ahead and zoom in. He's got his mother's eyes, lucky boy. Alright, and I'm going to go to the brush, and I'm just going to go really small brush and get rid of this area here because I don't want that. If it's giving me trouble, I'll just click on that blue brush to kind of give me a reassessment of that area that's giving me trouble. And that blue brush is magic. It really does help out a lot in those areas that you want to make sure that you keep. I think I'll just go ahead and press OK. Alright, so now if we take away our background, look at the mask that we've created. Our mask looks pretty good. So now we have this good mask. What we want to do is put a background here. So I'm going to go ahead and go into, I've got 3 backgrounds here. I can put them onto a wood background. So I'm just going to drag and drop this wood background right in onto my photo and drag it underneath my background copy. Now, sure, we now have a new background, but it looks completely unrealistic, and we have to ask ourselves why. So why does this look unrealistic? And the reason is because if you look at the sides of his hair, he's got this Gaussian blur that's happening from the bokeh of the lens. It was shot at f4, so anything that's closest to me is going to be in focus, and anything that's further away is going to be out of focus. So if we have a background that's in complete perfect focus, well, we have a problem there, right? So if we go to filter and go to blur and go to Gaussian blur, we can now blur that background. Let's blur it by about 10 pixels or so. So now that our background is blurred, it is helping out a little bit to separate the two. So if I also duplicate that background layer by pressing Command or Control J, move it above my my layer 1, that new layer, press filter, blur, average, and then change that to soft light, we're again mixing those color temperatures, just like we did in the last one. So when you mix those color temperatures together and you put the color temperature of the original photo on the color temperature of the new background, they start to blend with one another, and that looks really good. Now, there's also one more thing that I would do to help separate this, and that's create yet another layer, because I want to separate my background from my foreground. Alright, so I'm going to click on the brush tool, and with the brush tool selected, I'm just going to make a larger brush, much larger brush, and just hit that really big with white in the background. So it's really separating my foreground image from my background image a little too much, so I want to make it look more realistic. So I'm going to drop that down to about 40 or so %. And you can also change the blending option on that if you wanted to. You could change it to just about anything to make it look like it blends a little bit better. Hard mix blends pretty well. Let's look at something like soft light, not necessarily. Normal's not bad. Hard mix looks the same as normal. Pretty much you can change the blending option if it would make a difference, but for this one it doesn't really make a difference. But all that really did was it helped put a go-between between our foreground subject and our background layer. So now that we have that done, what we can do is we can replace that with several other backgrounds. So let's try this one. Just move that right in, put it right behind that background layer. Drop that down. Not too bad. Alright, now let's get another background. Maybe a brick background. It's funny because I took this brick background in a local area here and someone had carved Bud in the background. The funny thing is I call my son Bud a lot. Like, hey Bud, eat your dinner. But see, that looks pretty good now. It looks almost like it could be realistic, but again, because that background, it's a fresh background, we need to do the filter and we need to do the Gaussian blur on it. So once we do that Gaussian blur on it, it starts to blend even more so. Same thing with this one. Put that same Gaussian blur on there and it will blend even more. You want to match or even make the blur greater than the bokeh around your figure, because you don't stick your figure, your foreground figure, 2 feet away from the background. You usually have that foreground figure about anywhere between 4 and 6 feet away from your background, so that you can further separate them. So it's the same thing here. You want that bokeh to be a little bit more drastic in the background than it is in our foreground figure. So that's the basics of using Topaz ReMask to, number 1, replace a sky, and number 2, replace a background. The things that you want to consider when replacing a sky: make sure that you match the color temperature of the original sky with the color temperature the original sky's color temperature must match the new sky's color temperature. Otherwise, it will look fake and it will look really bad, and people will tell right away that you faked it. All right. The other thing that you want to consider with people is the same thing. You want to separate that foreground from the background. So you use Topaz ReMask to separate those figures, and then when you place them on the background, you want to make sure that those color temperatures match. So you do the same thing. You duplicate that background layer, the original copy, you change it to soft light, and then you change the blur to an average blur to get the average of all the colors in the original. So when you place it over top of the background, the color temperatures just tend to match pretty well. Also, when you do that, you can actually drag and drop that above the entire photo as a whole if you'd like, even over your original foreground layer. But I think what that does when we put it over top of the foreground layer there is it washes out the temperatures a little too much in our foreground, and we lose a lot of that original good color temperature that we had in that photograph. So just a couple of options. A lot of times we can't photograph our subjects on the image that we want to photograph them on. So it's a good idea to have a group of textures that you can drag and drop your elements onto. Again, my name is Blake Rudis with Everyday HDR and HDR Insider. This was a closer look at Topaz ReMask. If you like this, please comment, share, subscribe. I really do take in future tutorials from my subscribers. So this came from a subscriber. A specific subscriber had asked me if they could see this tutorial in a closer look. So if you have suggestions, just go ahead and shoot me an email, shoot me a YouTube message, and I'll be more than happy to oblige any of your tutorial needs.